Welcome to Historic Regalia, where history is not just told up, it is relived. If you're fascinated by tales of kings, queens, betrayal, and the power struggles that shaped the world, then you've arrived at the perfect place. Today, we begin a journey into the life of one of the most infamous monarchs of all time. A man who redefined kingship, altered the course of religion, and left behind a legacy drenched in both magnificence and blood. He's a broken bar is the story of Henry VIII, the ruthless king who changed history forever. But before he became the towering, larger-than-life king we know from portraits, a broad-shouldered, bearded, and intimidating Henry was a boy, never destined to rule at all. Born on June 28, 1491, at Greenwich Palace, he was the second son of Henry VII, the first Tudor king, and Elizabeth of York. His elder brother, Arthur, was the heir apparent to the golden child destined for the throne. Young Henry, meanwhile, was prepared for a very different path. As a second son, his future lay not in crowns or coronations but in the church. Henry was given a thorough education in theology, music, and languages. He was bright, charismatic, and athletic, with a love for jousting, hunting, and sport. Few could have imagined that this boy meant for robes of clergy would one day wear the crown of England. But fate had other plans. In 1501, Prince Arthur was married to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of the powerful Spanish monarchs, Ferdinand and Isabella. The union was meant to cement an alliance between England and Spain. But tragedy struck just months later. Arthur fell gravely ill and died, leaving the 10-year-old Henry suddenly thrust into the position of heir to the throne. This single twist of fate transformed Henry's life forever. From the shadows of his brother's promise, Henry emerged as England's future king. And with that destiny came not only power, but an insatiable hunger for glory. Henry's father, Henry VII, was a cautious, frugal king. He had fought his way to the throne after years of civil war during the Wars of the Roses. His reign was about stability, not spectacle. But young Henry was different. He dreamed of a Renaissance kingship, one filled with splendor, magnificence, and conquest. Where his father saved, Henry would spend. Where his father avoided war, Henry would seek it. And yet, the boy who would become king was also shaped by the turbulence of Tudor politics. Henry grew up in a court where loyalty was uncertain, treason was whispered in shadows, and power was always under threat. The Tudors were a new dynasty. Their claim to the throne was not unshakable. Henry absorbed these lessons early. If you wanted to rule England, you had to rule ruthlessly. When Henry VII died in 1509, the 17-year-old Henry ascended the throne. He was young, handsome, and full of vigor, described by ambassadors as the most promising prince in Christendom. England rejoiced. Gone was the austere, cautious old king. Here was a monarch who embodied vitality and ambition. But behind the charm and the pageantry, behind the music, poetry, and the jousting tournaments, there lay a man destined to become something far darker, a king who would stop at nothing to have his way. This was not just a new reign, it was the dawn of an age of upheaval. For Henry VIII was not simply a king of England, he would become a king who challenged popes, destroyed monasteries, executed those closest to him, and married 6 times in his relentless pursuit of power and legacy. And so, our story begins with a young king stepping into a throne he was never meant to inherit, armed with ambition, charm, and a dangerous hunger that would change history forever. When Henry VIII took the throne in 1509, England celebrated like never before. At just 17 years old, he was everything a Renaissance monarch was expected to be: handsome, tall, athletic, and charming. Chroniclers described him as a prince who excelled above all men. He was skilled in languages, a gifted musician, and a master of sport. To the people, he was the golden king, of the very embodiment of hope after years of cautious rule under his father. But almost immediately, Henry's reign was tied to marriage. His first act as king was to wed Catherine of Aragon, the widow of his late brother Arthur. This union was not without controversy. According to church law, marrying a brother's widow was forbidden. But Catherine insisted her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, and Pope Julius II granted a dispensation, allowing her to marry young Henry. For Henry, Catherine was more than a wife. She was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, one of the most powerful royal couples in Europe. Their marriage strengthened England's alliance with Spain, giving Henry legitimacy and prestige on the European stage. The new king and queen were celebrated across the realm. Their coronation was lavish, their court magnificent. Together, they looked like the ideal royal couple. At first, Henry's rule was marked by joy and grandeur. He loved tournaments, pageants, and festivals. He was a king who wanted to dazzle his people, to show that England was no longer the cautious kingdom of his father but a rising power to be reckoned with. Henry threw himself into jousting matches, dressed in glittering armor, the very image of knightly splendor. He commissioned masques, banquets, and works of art. He was not content to simply rule, he wanted to be admired. But beneath the golden image, Henry's ambitions were already clear. He wanted glory, not just at home, but abroad. Unlike his father, Henry longed for war, for conquest, for the chance to prove himself as a warrior king like those of old. And his eyes turned to France, England's traditional rival. He dreamed of reclaiming the lands once held by his ancestors and adding his name to the roll of kings who carved their legend on the battlefield. Yet as Henry pursued glory, Catherine faced the immense pressure of queenship. Her most important duty was to provide England with a male heir, a son who would secure the Tudor dynasty. Catherine was devoted to Henry, supporting him in matters of state, even acting as regent when he was abroad. But tragedy haunted their marriage. Between 1509 and 1518, Catherine gave birth to 6 children. Only one survived infancy, Mary, born in 1516. The rest were either stillborn or died within weeks. Henry adored his daughter, but in his mind, Mary was not enough. England needed a male heir. Without one, the fragile Tudor dynasty could crumble into chaos, just as it had during the Wars of the Roses. Still, in the early years, Henry remained devoted to Catherine. For over a decade, their marriage appeared strong. Catherine was admired for her piety, intelligence, and dignity. She was deeply respected by the English people. Ambassadors described Henry and Catherine as a harmonious royal couple. But the cracks were forming, cracks that would one day split not just a marriage, but an entire nation. For while Catherine bore the weight of failed pregnancies, Henry's hunger for greatness only grew. He was no longer the boy king of 1509. He was a ruler who believed he was chosen for destiny, a monarch whose power was sanctioned by God himself. And such a king, in his own eyes, deserved everything he desired: a glory in work, obedience at home, and above all, a son to inherit his throne. It was this hunger, this restless ambition that would soon drive Henry to decisions so ruthless, so transformative, that they would forever alter the course of England's history. By the mid-1520s, Henry VIII was no longer the fresh-faced golden king of his youth. He was now in his mid-30s, an experienced ruler with victories, alliances, and scars from political battles. But one thing haunted him, one thing kept him awake at night: his lack of a male heir. Catherine of Aragon, his queen for nearly 2 decades, had given him only one surviving child, a Princess Mary. Though bright and beloved, Mary was not what Henry desired. The Tudor dynasty was still young, fragile, and surrounded by enemies. In Henry's mind, only a son could secure his throne and prevent England from descending once again into civil war. But Catherine was now past childbearing age. Henry began to see their marriage not as a blessing, but as a curse, a failure that endangered the very future of his dynasty. And so, he reached for justification. In the book of Leviticus, Henry found a passage that declared a man who married his brother's wife would remain childless. To Henry, this was not coincidence, it was divine judgment. Their marriage, he argued, was never lawful in the eyes of God. Catherine, however, was unyielding. She swore her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated, and therefore their union was valid. She refused to be set aside, clinging fiercely to her crown and her daughter's future. What began as a personal dilemma soon became a political and religious crisis of epic proportions. Henry demanded an annulment, but such a request was not simple. Their marriage had been approved decades earlier by the Pope himself. For Henry to cast aside Catherine now would mean the Pope admitting his predecessor had dared a scandalous prospect. Enter Anne Boleyn. Unlike many of Henry's past mistresses, Anne was no fleeting affair. She was clever, ambitious, and refused to become just another royal conquest. Instead, she demanded something greater: marriage, the crown, and the chance to be queen. Henry was captivated. To him, Anne was not only passion but also possibility. She could provide the son Catherine never had. But to make Anne his queen, Henry needed his marriage to Catherine annulled. And the Pope, under pressure from Catherine's powerful nephew, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, refused. What followed was a standoff that shook the foundations of Christendom. Henry, determined to have his way, took a step no English king had ever dared before. He rejected the Pope's authority entirely. In a series of legal and religious maneuvers, Henry declared himself the supreme head of the Church of England, severing ties with Rome. Priests and bishops were forced to recognize his supremacy. Those who resisted were branded traitors. The annulment was finally granted by English authorities in 1533, and Henry secretly married Anne Boleyn. Catherine was stripped of her title and banished from court, never to see Henry again. For her, it was a devastating blow. For Henry, it was victory, but one that came at a cost. The break with Rome unleashed a storm across England. Centuries of loyalty to the Catholic Church were torn apart almost overnight. Monks, nuns, and clergy were forced to choose between the Pope and their king. Some complied, others resisted, and resistance often meant death. Henry's quest for a son had become far more than a private matter. It was now a revolution that transformed England forever. The king's personal desire had redrawn the map of religion, politics, and power. And yet, for all his bold defiance, Henry's triumph was incomplete. In 1533, Anne Boleyn gave birth not to the long-awaited son, but to a daughter, Elizabeth. Henry's disappointment was profound, but he pressed on. Surely, he believed, a son would follow. But what Henry could not yet see was that his actions had already reshaped history. By tearing England from the authority of the Pope, he had unleashed a legacy of division, conflict, and transformation that would echo for centuries. The king had won his will, but at what cost? When people hear the name Henry VIII, one image often comes to mind: a king with 6 wives. But behind that infamous number lies a story of passion, betrayal, political maneuvering, and ruthless ambition. Each wife represents not just a chapter of Henry's personal life, but the turning point in the history of England itself. We've already met the first two: Catherine of Aragon, the loyal queen cast aside after 20 years of marriage, and Anne Boleyn, the daring woman who helped spark a religious revolution. But Henry's quest for love and heirs was far from over. Anne Boleyn gave Henry a daughter, Elizabeth, in 1533. But years passed, and no son came. Miscarriages, failed pregnancies, and Henry's growing impatience soured their marriage. Anne, once adored, became the target of whispers and enemies at court. Henry, frustrated and desperate, looked for a way out. In 1536, Anne was arrested on charges of adultery, incest, and treason. Most historians believe the charges were fabricated, a convenient excuse to rid Henry of a wife who had failed to give him a son. On a May morning at the Tower of London, Anne knelt before a French swordsman and was executed. Henry had gambled everything to marry her, only to send her to her death 3 years later. But Henry wasted no time. Within days of Anne's execution, he married Jane Seymour, his third wife. Jane was everything Anne was not: gentle, quiet, obedient. More importantly, she gave Henry what he had longed for, a son. In 1537, Jane gave birth to Edward VIII, the future king. Henry was overjoyed, finally securing the Tudor dynasty. Yet his happiness was short-lived. Jane died from postnatal complications just days after Edward's birth. Henry mourned her deeply, calling her his true wife, the only one he claimed to have loved. But a king could not remain unmarried for long. In 1540, Henry agreed to marry Anne of Cleves, a German princess. The match was arranged to strengthen England's alliance with Protestant powers in Europe. But when Henry met Anne in person, he was horrified. Famously, he declared she looked nothing like her flattering portrait, calling her the Flanders mare. Their marriage lasted just 6 months before being annulled. Henry, ever pragmatic, gave Anne a generous settlement, and she lived comfortably in England, even becoming known as the king's beloved sister. Soon after, Henry married his fifth wife, Catherine Howard, a young woman barely in her late teens and more than 30 years younger than the king. Henry, now aging and plagued by health issues, was enchanted by her youthful energy. But Catherine was reckless. Just 2 years into the marriage, evidence emerged that she had been unfaithful. Henry was devastated. Betrayal, especially by a queen, was treason. In 1542, Catherine Howard was executed, another young woman meeting her end at the axe. Finally, in 1543, Henry married his sixth and last wife, Catherine Parr. Twice widowed before marrying the king, Parr was intelligent, sensible, and deeply religious. She cared for Henry in his declining years, acted as a stepmother to his children, and even influenced his will. Unlike her predecessors, she outlived him. 6 wives, 2 divorced, 2 executed, 1 died in childbirth, and 1 survived. Each marriage revealed something about Henry: his desperation for a son, his impulsive passions, and his ruthless willingness to sacrifice anyone who stood in his way. But the story of Henry's wives is not only about their tragic fates, it is about the daughters born of those unions, Mary and Elizabeth. Daughters Henry dismissed, overlooked, or even declared illegitimate, yet who would one day rule England with power and brilliance. In a cruel twist of fate, it was not Henry's longed-for son who became England's greatest monarch, but the daughter he had once considered a disappointment to Elizabeth I. Henry's marriages had been filled with turmoil, but through them, the Tudor dynasty was secured, and the stage was set for one of the most remarkable eras in history. Still, the king's ruthless pursuit of love and heirs was only part of his story. Behind the palace walls, Henry was also remaking the very fabric of England, tearing down monasteries, seizing wealth, and transforming his kingdom into a nation unlike any other in Europe. By the 1530s, Henry VIII was no longer just a king. He was the supreme head of the Church of England. But declaring himself head of the church was not enough. Henry wanted more power, more wealth, more control. And to get it, he turned his eyes toward one of the most ancient and powerful institutions in England: the monasteries. For centuries, monasteries had been the heart of English religious life. They were centers of learning, charity, and devotion. Monks and nuns cared for the poor, educated the young, and preserved knowledge. They were also wealthy, owning vast lands, treasures, and property across the kingdom. To Henry, this wealth was irresistible. The official justification was religious reform. Henry's advisers, especially Thomas Cromwell, argued that many monasteries were corrupt and outdated, clinging to traditions that no longer served the new Church of England. But in truth, Henry saw an opportunity. By dissolving the monasteries, he could fill his coffers, reward his allies, and weaken any lingering loyalty to the Pope. In 1536, the process began. Monks and nuns were ordered to leave their homes. Lands were seized by the crown, gold and silver stripped from altars, libraries dismantled. The treasures of centuries were melted down, sold off, or destroyed. What had once been the beating heart of English spiritual life was reduced to rubble and profit. The dissolution of the monasteries was one of the most dramatic acts of Henry's reign. It fundamentally changed the landscape of England. Vast tracts of land once owned by the church now passed into the hands of nobles and gentry, creating a new class of landowners whose loyalty depended on the king. Ancient abbeys and monasteries were left as ruins, haunting reminders of a vanished age. But the dissolution was not without resistance. In the north of England, thousands rose up in protest during the Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive rebellion demanding the restoration of the monasteries and the old faith. Men and women marched under the banner of Christ, believing they were defending God's will against a tyrant king. Henry pretended to negotiate, promising mercy in reform. But it was a deception. Once the rebels laid down their arms, Henry unleashed his fury. Leaders were arrested, executed, and their bodies displayed as warnings. Mercy had no place in Henry's rule. By crushing the rebellion and seizing the monasteries, Henry not only secured enormous wealth but also cemented his reputation as a ruthless monarch. His power was now absolute, unchecked by pope, priest, or tradition. Yet in destroying the monasteries, Henry also unleashed long-lasting consequences. Thousands of monks, nuns, and workers were left homeless. Education and charity networks collapsed. The religious unity of England was broken, replaced by deep divisions that would spark generations of conflict. To Henry, It was a triumph, a king reshaping his kingdom according to his will. To many others, it was a tragedy, that destruction of a sacred heritage for the sake of a king's greed. But Henry was not done. Even as he seized the wealth of the church and remade England in his image, his own body was betraying him. The once athletic Golden King was becoming a shadow of himself, obese, paranoid, and increasingly cruel. The glory of his youth was fading, replaced by suspicion, rage, and fear. The story of Henry VIII was entering its final, darkest phase. By the 1540s, Henry VIII was no longer the dazzling golden prince who had once charmed Europe. The years of jousts, feasts, and battles had taken their toll. His once athletic body swelled with obesity, his legs ulcerated and foul-smelling, leaving him in constant agony. Beneath the silks and jewels, Henry was a man rotting from within. But what he lost in physical strength, he replaced with sheer ruthlessness. The aging king ruled not with charisma, but with fear. No only a friend, family, or ally was safe from his suspicion. Once, Henry had relied on trusted advisers to carry out his will. But by the 1540s, many of them were dead, executed as the very order of the king they had served. Thomas More, who refused to recognize Henry as head of the church, was beheaded. Thomas Cromwell, the architect of the dissolution of the monasteries, was accused of treason and executed when he fell out of favor. Even nobles of ancient lineage, once untouchable, could find themselves in the Tower. Henry had become a master of political theater. Charges of treason or heresy were often fabricated, trials were a formality, and executions were staged as public lessons in obedience. The message was clear: the king's will was law, and opposition meant death. But his tyranny was not only political, it was personal. Henry's marriages had left him with 3 children: Mary, daughter of Catherine of Aragon, Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, and Edward, son of Jane Seymour. At various times, Henry declared Mary and Elizabeth illegitimate, only to later restore them when it suited him. The fate of his children rose and fell with his moods, their futures hanging on the shifting winds of their father's wrath. In court, fear reigned supreme. Courtiers flattered Henry endlessly, knowing one wrong word could mean the axe. Ambassadors described him as unpredictably one moment charming and generous, the next raging with fury. Paranoia gnawed at him. He suspected plots everywhere, seeing betrayal in the shadows of his court. And yet, despite his cruelty, Henry remained a king of immense authority. His image was carefully managed. Grand portraits showed him broad-shouldered, dominant, staring down at his subjects with unshakable power. Even in decline, Henry projected strength, ensuring that no one would dare forget who ruled England. In 1547, after nearly 38 years on the throne, Henry VIII died at the age of 55. His body was so bloated it reportedly took a mechanical device to lower his coffin into the crypt. The once vigorous prince who had dazzled Europe ended his life broken, feared, and loathed by many. But Henry left behind more than a corpse. He left a kingdom utterly transformed. The monasteries were gone, the Pope's authority banished, the church reshaped in his image. His 6 wives had rewritten the politics of Europe, and his children Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward would carry forward a dynasty that still shapes the world today. Henry VIII had begun as a prince never meant to rule. He had ended as a tyrant who bent an entire nation to his will. Loved and feared, admired and despised, he was the king who believed his desire was destiny. And in that belief, he changed history forever. In January of 1547, the bells of England tolled the death of King Henry VIII. The monarch who had reigned for nearly 4 decades, was gone. His son, the frail boy Edward VIII, would inherit the throne, but it was Henry's towering presence that continued to loom over England long after his death. Few kings have left a legacy as complex, as contradictory, and as enduring as Henry VIII. He was a man of dazzling charm and terrifying cruelty, a Renaissance prince who loved music, poetry, and learning, yet also a tyrant who shed blood without hesitation. His personal desires reshaped an entire nation. In his desperate quest for a male heir, he broke from the Catholic Church, dismantled monasteries, and declared himself head of a new English faith. The England Henry left behind was no longer the England he had inherited. It was wealthier, more centralized, and more independent than ever before, but also scarred by division, religious conflict, and fear. And yet, history has a way of twisting fate. The son Henry fought so desperately to have, Edward, reigned only briefly before dying young. His daughters Mary and Elizabeth would outshine him in ways he never expected. Mary's reign was turbulent and tragic, but Elizabeth's would become legendary. The daughter Henry, once dismissed as a disappointment, became one of England's greatest monarchs, ushering in the golden age of Shakespeare, exploration, and empire. Henry VIII's story reminds us of the dangerous power of unchecked ambition. He began as a boy never meant to rule, and he ended as a king who bent the laws of God and man to his will. Some remember him as a tyrant, others as a visionary who laid the foundation of modern England. But none can deny that he was a king who refused to be forgotten. Even today, nearly 5 centuries later, the image of Henry VIII, broad, bearded, and unyielding, still commands attention. His life was a storm of love, betrayal, faith, and fury. He was not merely a king of his time, he was a king who changed the course of history forever. And that brings us to the end of this story on Henry VIII, the ruthless king who changed history forever. If you've enjoyed this journey into the past, don't forget to join us again here on Historic Regalia, where the grandeur, the intrigue, and the unforgettable drama of history come alive. Subscribe for more stories of kings and queens, empires and revolutions, and the timeless struggles for power that shaped our world. Until next time, remember, history is not just what happened, it is the story of who we are.